Hey Internet, Gordon Young with PC World here. Excited to talk about Qualcomm Snapdragon X Elite. Finally, after months and months and months of hype from Qualcomm and Microsoft. Of course, over the last week, you've been seeing a lot of reviews roll out on laptops using Snapdragon X Elite. You can read our own coverage. You can read reviews of the Surface Laptop 7 and the Surface Pro that we've seen so far. We have other laptops coming as well. But I want to take some time to dive into Snapdragon X Elite, the SoC itself. This isn't necessarily a look only at the SoC or laptop, but you cannot really separate the two. So let's get into how I looked at the Snapdragon X Elite and what I'm going to compare it to. I will actually break that out with the specs of the two laptops that I used. On the left, actually, let's start on the right. On the right is the star of the show, the Microsoft Surface Laptop 7. It has a Windows 11 Home. You can see all those specs. It has a Snapdragon X Elite X1E 80-100. That's basically, not quite the top end Snapdragon X. And I'm going to be putting that up against an Asus ZenBook 14 OLED. That is a 14-inch laptop with an OLED panel. Windows 11 Pro instead of Home. Hey, that's a much better value you're getting out of Asus there. And of course, it has Intel's Core Ultra 7 155H. So that always throws me for a loop because I always want to say Core 7 or Core i7. But it's actually Core Ultra 7 155H going up against the X1E 80-100. And if you don't speak actual nerd, I will translate it for you. The Qualcomm Snapdragon X has 12 cores in it, performance cores only. The Core Ultra 7 has 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, 2 low power efficiency cores, and a total of 22 threads because the performance cores actually have hyper-threading in them. And of course, 14-inch panel, as I said earlier. It is an OLED panel, 2880 by 1800, 120 hertz, going up against the Surface Laptop 7 with a 13.8-inch IPS 2304 by 1536-inch panel. Sharp IPS panel, also 120 hertz. One thing I do want to note is, OLED is wonderful, it looks beautiful, but it generally does consume more power than IPS, especially on things that have lighter backgrounds, white backgrounds. It just uses more power. So the ZenBook 14 is at a disadvantage against the Microsoft Surface Laptop. But you kind of make up for it on the ZenBook 14 OLED because it has a larger battery. It has a 75 watt hour battery spec. It actually doesn't quite charge all the way up to 75 watts, but be that as it may, that's going up against the 54 watt hour battery in the Surface Laptop 7. So, OLED panel uses a little more power, but it has a bigger battery. IPS uses less power generally on lighter backgrounds, but it does actually have a smaller battery. So it kind of possibly equalizes it. There is really no way you can compare only the SoCs itself, unless maybe Framework made a version with a Snapdragon X and a Core Ultra 7. That would be actually the cool way to do it, or another OEM that actually does that. Also, other specs, Wi-Fi 6E versus Wi-Fi 7. Again, the ports and all that stuff. Obviously, the ZenBook 14 OLED has Thunderbolt 4 ports. The Microsoft Surface Laptop 7 has USB 4 ports. I'll get into that a little bit later. And the weight is about the same. That, to me, is the most important thing, is you basically have two 14-inch screen laptops, and they both weigh just under 3 pounds apiece. There is quite a bit of a price difference between these. Microsoft really likes to jack you for the money if you go up to 32 gigs. These are both 32 gig LPDDR5X laptops, so that's good because I wouldn't want to put a 16 gig against a 32 gig. But you're looking at $2,000 for the Surface Laptop 7 versus $1,300 for the ZenBook 14. So not much of a comparison in actual value because the specs are very similar. But obviously, you're buying a Surface Laptop 7 because you want the Microsoft brand on it. You also may want to get into the exciting Snapdragon X Elite stuff that you've heard all the hype about. So let's actually get into the performance benchmarks. We're going to kick it off in a familiar place, and this is Cinebench 2024. This is actually fairly new to me. I basically have been in Carbonite for about half a year, and I have not actually used Cinebench 2024. It is an improvement over the other version, R23. There's no R in 2024 if you use the right nomenclature. Basically, Maxon uses the same engine they use in their actual Cinema 4D product. So it's an actual real 3D rendering engine. It's not just totally made up, but it is a benchmark based around that. They basically said, for 2024, we're going to really up the memory requirements. It's also going to up the model. So it's actually quite a bit tougher to run than R23. So 2024 is the big difference here. The other big difference, too, I do want to note is it is very different for 2024 as well as R23 in some ways, because ARM chips, like in the MacBook Pro, like in the Snapdragon X, don't actually have AVX2, AVX. They don't have a lot of x86 instruction set extensions that you will get out of AMD and Intel. So what Maxon did is they actually made a version that actually runs the native instruction set, Neon, I believe, for ARM chips that is, comparable to AVX, AVX2. So it would run on these, but it is a little weird because you're now actually running different code paths. And previously, you'd feel better if you were running AMD and Intel, and they're both doing almost exactly the same thing. So there's a little bit of a fork in the road here. But arguably, you're saying the only thing that matters is you hit the go button. At the end, you get your 3D model, and the only thing you care about is how long it took and the quality of it. But for comparison, I actually also threw in results from the MacBook Pro 14, the MacBook Air 15 that our sister site Macworld ran themselves. So these are independent results, not from Apple or from somebody else. So it's actually from an independent third outlet. And I also ran it on two other older laptops just to get a feel for it. That's the ZenBook Pro 14 OLED, which has an Core i9-13900H. That's a Raptor Lake CPU in there. Higher wattage, thicker laptop. It's still a 14-inch panel, but it's thicker because it has a GeForce RTX 4070 laptop GPU in it, and a Razer Blade 14, which has a Ryzen 9 7940HS in there. That's an 8-core Ryzen. It's not the latest version of Ryzen 9, but I just wanted to get a feel in there because I didn't have a current Ryzen-based laptop that I feel is in the same class. Also, the Razer Blade 14 and the Asus ZenBook Pro 14 OLED both have, again, GeForce RTX 4070 laptop GPUs in them. They're basically content creation laptops, and for the most part, they're thicker. They have better fans. They have much, much larger power bricks, 200 watts, 230. So they will wallop a thin and light laptop easily all day, and believe me, they will crush all of the laptops that I would consider to have integrated graphics when you decide to actually use that RTX 4070 laptop GPU in there. But Cinebench 2024 here is running all cores. We are running them only on this test only is being run on the CPU, so it's a good comparison to get. And the one that probably Qualcomm cares about is Snapdragon X Elite versus the ZenBook 14 OLED, and you're basically looking at roughly a 27% advantage for that Snapdragon X Elite with its 12 cores versus the 22 threads of that ZenBook 14 OLED. So that's a pretty big win, I would say, for Snapdragon X Elite. Not a surprise because we've been seeing Cinebench 2024 results for many, many months now. So not a shocker. And then, of course, Snapdragon X Elite also puts the MacBook Air 15 M3s in their place as well. Those, of course, are not the biggest and baddest MacBook Pros, but they are similar in weight to the Snapdragon X Elite and the Surface Laptop 7. So it easily beats both of those MacBook Pros. Those, of course, have the 8-core, 4 performance cores, 4 efficiency cores. So, but in pure core count, it does quite well. But obviously, if you're looking at more performance, even though the Ryzen 9 only has 8 cores, it still handily beats the Snapdragon X Elite because, again, it's pushing higher wattage. It's just running a lot harder. And 8 cores of Ryzen 9 running with more power still easily beats the Snapdragon X Elite by a bit. And even the older Core i9-13900H easily also outruns the Snapdragon X Elite. So if you really do need heavy duty, I'm going to run every single core all the time, I would recommend that you get a laptop that's just simply going to weigh more, that has discrete graphics instead of integrated graphics. So again, Razer Blade 14, the ZenBook Pro 14 OLED. In fact, even the MacBook Pro 14 with a bigger M3 in there is probably going to get you overall better experience if you are really going to be pushing all the cores all the time for a content creation task. Realistically, though, Surface Laptop 7 will be going against the MacBook Air 15, again, also against the ZenBook 14 OLED, or say like an older MacBook Air M2, basically. Thin and light, sub 3 pound is the class I'd put it at. But still, this is a pretty nice win, and, not much of a surprise for people that have been looking at results for Snapdragon X all these months. But I still want to see this independently verified because I ran these benchmarks myself. Next up is Cinebench 2024. Same deal, but we're going to look at it single-threaded performance instead of using all the cores. So you get this weirdness like, oh well, this has 8 cores, this has 12 cores, this has 16 cores, blah 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 blah. This is just simply looking at the performance if you run it on one single core on these laptops. So the winner overall, of course, is MacBook with the M3s. All due respect to Apple, they've got a really good part. They've got really good TSMC process there. They are basically about 14% ahead of the Snapdragon X Elite and the Surface Laptop 7. So pretty decent. I mean, arguably, though, like average person may not feel that, but still, first is first, and both those M3s are well ahead of the Snapdragon X Elite. Probably more important to Qualcomm is that they are about 18% faster than that Core Ultra 7 155H. Again, that is with Intel's best current CPU. Yes, I know they have Lunar Lake coming out very, very soon now, we hope. But from what's available from Intel, the Snapdragon X Elite is well ahead of it in single-threaded performance. They're also ahead of that Ryzen 9, even though you saw when you push all those cores, the Ryzen 9 is ahead of it. But, it's still the single-core performance. The winner is Snapdragon X Elite. It is also ahead of that Core i9 1300H. Arguably, maybe a Core Ultra 9 with a little bit higher clock could help it a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be enough to beat that Snapdragon X Elite overall. But so again, both of these are very good showing for the Snapdragon X Elite overall against Intel and against AMD. So that's really worthwhile. Let's move on though. Let's keep going. Next up is Handbrake 1.80. Basically, I'm using the almost newest version. They actually came out with the 1.81, just some bug fixes very recently. I take the 4K Tears of Steel file that anybody can download. I basically encode it to AV1, not 10-bit, so 8-bit, using the main profile. The rest are default, setting it to the same frame rate. So basically the same source frame rate as the original file. I'm leaving the Max off of here because I don't have results for 1.80 from Macworld. But I do have it for the Razer Blade 14 and the ZenBook Pro 14. Again, like I said, if you're really going to be pushing these things, all of those CPU cores as hard as you can, you're just going to get more performance out of a thicker, heavier laptop, again, with a much, much larger power brick. We're looking at 200-watt power bricks and quite a bit more weight, but not that much bigger. But you're just simply going to get more performance out of a content creation laptop with, discrete graphics, with Radeon, with GeForce, as well as a CPU that's just simply pushed harder. But what matters here, though, is the 3-pound laptop category, because, again, 3-pound laptops, they weigh nothing in your bag, and you want to see what's going to win here. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, the Snapdragon X Elite is slightly ahead of the Core 7 Ultra. And again, shorter bar is better. This is how long it took to encode the file. And you're looking at basically about these Surface Laptop finishing the encode about 4%. And 4% less time than the ZenBook 14 with that Core Ultra 7. So win for the Snapdragon X Elite in the Handbrake encode. And for people who don't know, I want to mention again, Handbrake is actually optimized for ARM, so this is not running emulated. So, but this is again a nice advantage here for Snapdragon X Elite. Not a huge win, but still a win overall, and that's probably the only thing that matters. And this is with a real world Handbrake, really popular encoder that a lot of people use. And we're using AV1, which is pure CPU. I'm not really using any of the hardware encode circuits that are available in the SoCs here. So I really just want to see the CPU performance. One rationale for that are there's people who really think the image quality when you do a CPU encode is simply the best out of Handbrake. And there are people, even though they have NVENC or they have QuickSync or they have whatever, Apple Toolbox or AMD's hardware encode paths, they actually still do it on CPU because they think the quality is better. So even though So it's that very real world I want to point out. So I know a lot of people think like, why would you ever use a CPU to do an encode when you have QuickSync or NVEnc or what are the other things? But there are people who do that. So that's one argument for it. Okay, let's keep going. Next one is Blender 4.1. I take the Barbershop CPU file. I use cycles. Again, I'm doing a CPU encode. And the winner, again, shorter bar is better, but you get a very nice advantage for ZenBook 14 OLED with the Core Ultra 7 to the tune of about 28% less time for this render than the Snapdragon X Elite, even though generally you saw it win in Handbrake, you saw it win in Cinebench, which is all, again, all core, all thread loads. It loses. The reason, you could arguably say, like, this might be the emulation here. I mean, you're looking at 28% of a difference in Blender 4.1. And the current version of Blender is not optimized for ARM, so I'm basically running it emulated using the Prism emulation layer in Windows on ARM, and that is potentially what is making it slower here than the ZenBook 14 OLED. So let's take an opportunity to sort of like, okay, well let's look at it. Is it possible it's actually Prism? It's the emulation? Because one of the big questions people have is like, how bad of a hit am I going to take if I'm going to run emulation mode on the Snapdragon X Elite? So one way I tried to get a look at this is, again, Blender 4.1 here is running emulated. I decided to use CPU-Z Bench. I know people probably aren't that familiar with that CPU-Z itself, though. They may use to, you can download this utility. It's free. It's an awesome utility to tell you specs and information about your CPU. There's actually a little benchmark that's built in there for that validation. Not a lot of people do use it, except interestingly, to leak performance results. But I decided to use it here because CPU-Z Bench has a version you can download for x86. It has a version you can download for Windows on ARM. So using CPU-Z Bench 2.09 for x86 and 2.09 for ARM, you can see a difference here. So again, the top result here is running on x86, all cores. And this is emulated. This is only running on the Surface Laptop 7 on Snapdragon X Elite. You're looking at about 5,900 versus running it native, so about 8,300, right? And that turns out to be about 28% difference. So you're looking at about 28%. Again, let's go back. Let's check this out. Let's go back to Blender. About 28% performance advantage for ZenBook 14 OLED. And actually looking only at Surface Laptop 7 with Snapdragon X Elite, with that X1E80 running emulation layer, I'm seeing about a 28% reduction in performance. Running it natively, again, about 8262. We run it emulated, we drop down about 5887, so about 28% difference. And same thing, if you're looking at a single-threaded performance, 690 versus 490, basically roughly the same thing. You're looking at about a 28% difference, 29% difference. So it's pretty close. I mean, it's not perfect science, but it is interesting to see running the x86 emulated version versus running the native version. Basically, CPU-Z Bench, multi-core and single core, you're looking at about 28 to 29% difference, similar to the hit we saw with Blender. So I think we could say you're going to take about a third of a haircut if you're going to be running emulated mode using Prism. Of course, Microsoft and Qualcomm have promised it's only going to get better from here. Okay, I get it. We'll see. But one thing I do want to point out is like, oh, well, we're seeing CPU-Z Bench, we're seeing Blender cut off about 30% performance. We're going to see that everywhere, right? Well, not necessarily, because the next result is a little bit of a shocker. I was reading while I was doing all this testing that somebody said, hey, I'm testing the Surface Laptop 7. This is another reviewer. And I'm seeing the Adobe Lightroom Classic performance just simply suck. I'm doing a JPEG export, and the performance is absolutely atrocious. And that is, of course, because Lightroom Classic is not optimized for ARM. It is only x86, so you have to run it in an emulation layer. I said, oh, as a reviewer, I want to see the ugliness. I want to see that train wreck. So I downloaded Lightroom Classic. I fed it a bunch of JPEG files, and I did an export. And I expected Snapdragon X Elite to, get punched in the face by Core Ultra 7. Did I? No. because you can see here running Adobe Lightroom Classic 13.3.1, which I verified in Task Manager was running in emulated mode. I take 500 JPEGs, not the largest. They were actually shot many years ago by me on a 1D Mark II-N, which is, not a high megapixel camera. So maybe there's a difference if you're using really, really high resolution JPEGs and modern cameras, but still, using these JPEGs, I exported 500 of them to the local SSD on both. They both have Gen 4 SSDs. The SSD in the actual ZenBook actually slightly outperforms the SSD in the Surface Laptop 7, but this is a manual time, so I use a stopwatch to time it. On the Snapdragon X Elite, it took 48 seconds to export 500 JPEGs, and that is applying a watermark, basically a copyright notice, as well as a light sharpen for screen and about 90% quality for the JPEG. So it's typically what you would do in Lightroom Classic, but 48 seconds on the Snapdragon X Elite, again, that's better because you don't want to sit there and wait for the damn thing to export your files, versus 104 seconds for the ZenBook 14 OLED with that Core Ultra 7 in there. So that's less than half the time to do that export in Snapdragon X Elite, which I did not expect. Again, I did this test specifically because I saw another reviewer that said, hey, I'm seeing Lightroom Classic performance suck in JPEG exports. Well, not me. I don't know if they ran the same version of Lightroom Classic or they ran it the same way. Again, maybe they're using different JPEGs, but my experience using the JPEGs that I had, like Snapdragon X Elite, even though we're running emulated, should have been slower, right? But it's actually faster than the Core 7 Ultra, which was a bit of a shock to me. So I said, well, okay, well, maybe it's my JPEGs. Let's try something else. So up next, I used Lightroom Classic. Now I feed it 100 CR2 files. These are actually slightly higher resolution files. These are not shot on the 1D Mark II. And these are actually shot on a 5D Mark III, I believe. Could have been a Mark II, but I've had various Canon cameras over the years. This is on my 5D Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV. I don't know which one, but probably the Mark III or Mark IV. But it does close up a little bit. I'm only doing 100 CR2 files, but we're seeing still the Snapdragon X Elite running emulated, taking 24 seconds to finish the export. And again, same thing. Copyright, watermark, light sharpen for screen, as well as 90% JPEG quality. 24 seconds versus 35 seconds of that Core Ultra 7 in the ZenBook 14 works out to about 31% less time to do that export. So again, I'm at a loss. I sort of assume like, okay, well, maybe with Prism, with the emulation mode, it's just going to be bad all the time. You just simply take a 30% haircut. But again, using Lightroom Classic, running emulated, exporting CR2 files, exporting JPEGs, my results were the opposite, where the Snapdragon X Elite was simply faster. Even though it's emulated, is this the core? It would probably take a lot more digging into to find out. One thing I do want to point out for people who don't know, Adobe has long time done its own optimizations for RAW file handling. They don't take the formula from Nikon, from Sony, from Canon. They actually like to reverse engineer it themselves. But I'm pretty sure they have not worked on sort of going back in to update their RAW file handling for an old Canon, 5D Mark III. It's just a very old camera, so I doubt this has changed very much. So I don't know. It's a bit of a head scratcher because, again, I fully expected it to kind of stink here, but it didn't. It didn't at all. So bit of a shock. Okay, let's keep moving on. Let's look at something simple like browsing. So here I use Chrome 1.26 or 126. God knows what version they're on these days. It just keeps getting a bigger number. I ran, of course, Speedometer, which is a very popular benchmark at BrowserBench. I would say not a big difference, about 11.5% better performance for the Snapdragon X. Still a solid win, but again, you're going to feel it. I don't know. Also, I ran BaseMark 3. That's basically a browser-based graphics benchmark. I want to point out I'm not doing in fact, I'm not doing any really focused graphics or gaming testing here. We actually have a story on PC World written by Matt Smith. You're going to want to go read that if you actually are considering buying a Snapdragon X laptop for gaming. Read that story first, and also Adam is working on some gaming performance tests with a Snapdragon X. So I'm going to kind of skip over that. We're just going to look at mostly the SoC CPU performance. But Basemark here is basically graphics intensive, and we're basically dead even between the Core Ultra 7 with its ARC graphics and the Snapdragon X Elite with its Adreno graphics. And then WebExpert 4 is, I like this benchmark. It's made by Principal Technologies. It's basically simulated web performance. What I like is it runs a little bit longer, and traditionally has sort of favored Intel, but that not always, because Zen has actually beaten Intel here. But in this case, Intel has about a 19% advantage with the Core Ultra 7 over the Snapdragon X. So one thing I will say is, like, if you're going to think that all the time, if you're looking only speedometer, that, always Snapdragon X is going to be faster, there are many, many, many different browser benchmarks. There are an untold amount of things you can do in a browser, and it may not always be that, because obviously, clearly in WebExpert 4, it's got a 19% advantage for Core Ultra 7, but speedometer gives it about 11-12% advantage for Snapdragon X, and then Basemark is basically dead even. So I would say both of them are going to give you pretty solid browsing performance. So I probably wouldn't sweat it, frankly. I wouldn't worry about it whether you had a Core Ultra 7 or a Snapdragon X Elite, because they're both going to give you an excellent browsing experience. Okay, let's keep going. This one is a really cool benchmark. It's actually made by an Excel esports competitor, Jason Moore. That's not what he does for his job. He works for a financial firm making real money, but this guy can drive an Excel spreadsheet. He can drive Excel like Jim Rockford can drive a Firebird. So he knows the ins and outs of Excel. And a while ago, when I did an interview with him, I asked if he could provide a spreadsheet that I could do to, run performance tests on laptops. He said, "Oh yeah, sure. This is actually a benchmark that he created for me. It's based on a real world spreadsheet, though. So it's not just simply created wholesale cloth to, like, let's just make stuff up." At a certain point, Jason basically sat down. He looked at multiple databases like OpenTable and all these other like databases available to him, to start trying to calculate what was happening in the world during the first days of the pandemic. He just really was trying to get a feel for, like, are we turning the corner here? What's going on? Are reservations going down again? He lives in that world of money. So he was looking like, where's the upside for us? So it's a real world benchmark. It's super intense. And again, it's an expertly created Excel spreadsheet. And it takes about 8 minutes to run on both of these laptops. And the advantage goes to Core Ultra 7 here. Not a huge amount, but you're looking at about 2% advantage. Both of these, in fact, all the tests previous to, if you want to know, the laptops were set to their best performance settings in the operating system, and on the Asus laptop, you actually can crank up the fan, so that gives you a little more dynamic TDP. So that was also run. So both of these basically are run plugged into the wall and looking at performance with their best performance settings. And, dead even, which is a good show for both of these. Or again, 8 minutes on this really, really intensive spreadsheet is quite impressive. And I do want to put out the caveat that I haven't often used this spreadsheet because it is very difficult sometimes to get the same results, because Microsoft likes to push out updates to Office every week. And with the new versions and the inability to control the version, the performance just kind of moves up and down all over the place. But because I was able to test both of these laptops at the same time, I could make sure that I had the exact same version of Excel. And if you don't know, Office for ARM is optimized as well as it is for x86. So this is not running emulated. So this is native ARM support on both of these. But again, pretty good showing from both of these. It is a core intensive. It is memory intensive. And still good showing, and dead even basically for real world. So basically, if you are a financial nerd running Excel hard, you'd be pretty happy with the Snapdragon X Elite or a Core Ultra 7 if you wanted a very lightweight laptop. Okay, keep going here. So the previous test was actually, again, based on an actual real world spreadsheet. This is not. This is UL's Procyon Office. It basically takes Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook. It creates artificial workloads across all of these, but they are uh, meant to simulate what you would do in the real world. So editing Word documents, editing Excel, using some fairly advanced Excel calculations there, but again, certainly nowhere near approaching what the previous Excel spreadsheet did. Also PowerPoint and Outlook. And basically, it runs the machines through this, and then it calculates a score. And you can see overall, the winner is a Snapdragon X Elite. Again, Office on ARM. Office is optimized for ARM here, but Snapdragon X is about 7% faster than the Core Ultra 7. So nice showing here, and that's the overall score. And the standouts are basically Word, where the Snapdragon X has about a 10.5% advantage, and Outlook, where it has 10%. And they're basically dead even in Excel and PowerPoint. So I would say both of these should give you similar performance when plugged into the wall, when set the best performance. Again, the actual real winner is Snapdragon X, but I don't think most people would feel a difference when you're plugged into the wall, when you're running the best performance on both these laptops. There will be more on that later on, though, as we go on, because I do continue to use Procyon Office. So what I do like about Procyon Office is it is very real world. This is not using, hey, open source people, you're doing great work out there, but, most of the business world runs on Office. So most people care about Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook performance. So you could take these results, go to your IT department and say, I want this laptop because I want this performance. So, and that's what your IT department's going to go say, oh yeah, we run Office. So, okay, we'll do that. So that's what the value of this is. But Office matters, and better performance slightly goes to Snapdragon X. So win there. Okay, keep going. Another real-world application is Photoshop 20. Adobe Photoshop 25.9. It's the latest version that I could download. And this is using Puget Systems Puget Bench 1.1.7. It is the current version of Puget Bench. It basically opens up some raw files. It runs it through some certain actions, spits out an overall score. Winner, Snapdragon X. Again, we're seeing a pretty good trend here, right? Slightly faster than Core Ultra 7. Not huge all the time, but generally, Photoshop, Office, generally very light loads, and it just simply has a little bit more performance than Core Ultra 7, even though, again, that is Intel's current best chip in Meteor Lake. Again, they do have Core Ultra 9, but, Snapdragon X also has, E82 and E84. They actually have higher clock versions too. So they both have higher clock versions. I would consider these sort of the higher to mid-range chips. But overall, the win goes to Snapdragon X Elite. One thing, though, is if you're looking at this overall result, it doesn't tell the whole story. There is more data to dive into, which I do in the next slide, and is very worthwhile because Puget Bench actually gives you the results. Like here's how we calculated the score. Here's the actual performance. Because when you're looking at applications like Photoshop, there are hundreds and thousands of different things that you can just dive into and drill down and do on those that are all differently. So it is very hard to just take one score and go, oh, better is faster, because I can tell you there are some things that it isn't. And you can see, though, so first up, let's look at the general score. And for general score, again, Snapdragon X, about 9% advantage over that Core Ultra 7. So nice win here. And looking at the filter score, again, still a win, solid 5% over the Core Ultra 7 for Snapdragon X Elite. So good stuff. And you can see, let's dive into the details. So it's like, well, where are we actually seeing this result from? So in one of the tests, Puget Bench takes Photoshop, tells Photoshop, take this file, resize it to 150 megapixels using the preserved details, and then we're going to count this towards your general score. And the seconds, so this basically takes seconds, so a shorter time is better. And actually, Snapdragon X loses here handily. It takes about 13.4 seconds for Snapdragon X to do this. It takes about 3.2 seconds for Core Ultra 7. So this is actually a big win for Core Ultra 7, because that is a solid 10 seconds faster to do this resize using 150 megapixels preserved details. So it's not always what you sort of see in the score, because you go like, oh, general score better for Snapdragon. I need Snapdragon. But look, if this resize preserved details, the win solidly goes to Intel here. And Interestingly, though, so I said I actually went into Photoshop. I took one of my files and I tried to, I basically did a resize using preserved details and fairly large, similar 150-ish megapixels, and actually they ended up being the same. So I couldn't actually reproduce this myself trying to do it, but again, this is multiple runs by Puget Bench, and the winner is again Intel, to the tune of finishing this 76% less time than the Snapdragon X. But as we go on, there are plenty of wins for the Snapdragon X. If we go down and look at Smudge Tool, I would say these are like wash. This is like we're looking at a second and a half. Some things are the wins go to Snapdragon X. Some things you go to Intel, but you're looking at a second. To me, like that's like not a big deal. But you go to Smudge Tool. So the win solidly goes to Snapdragon X, taking 13.9 seconds versus 19.7 for the Core 7 Ultra. And then also, look, adaptive wide angle. This is a filter test, and you're looking at 78 seconds versus 91.8 seconds for the Core Ultra 7. That's basically about a 15% advantage in time for the Snapdragon X. And then, look, we have a win here for lens correction filter. Sizable win, again, taking roughly 40% less time to do that lens correction filter. And then content-aware fill, it actually loses. So Intel actually has a nice little lead here in content-aware fill. Looks like to the tune of about 30% less time. And then also we do reduce noise, and Snapdragon X actually loses here. Reduce noise, about 39% less time for Snapdragon X. Actually, wait, where was I? Got a little mixed up there. Reduced noise, actually win for Snapdragon X, taking about 40%. So again, as you go through these things, you can see there's definitely, wins and losses going both ways. Overall, though, I mean, still the general score, it's enough wins for Snapdragon X that it gets the general score and filter score, which of course gives the overall win. But again, look at this. This is a nice win. File save, interestingly, 65.5 seconds for that Core Ultra 7 to save that file versus 39.6. And then again, slower save for just PSD file, just another save. So there's just definitely some things where, Snapdragon X, it just I don't know if it's something where basically the ARM version, they basically updated the file system to take advantage of something going on in Windows on ARM, but it's doing quite well overall in a lot of these things that seem to touch the SSD here. But there's also some wins for Intel. So overall, the win does solidly. Again, we can go back to this result here. The win goes to Photoshop and Photoshop 25.9 to Snapdragon X. So solidly win for Snapdragon X, right? Well, it does get a little weird, and I'm going to show you the one reason why it kind of bugs me, because overall, again, the win is slightly for Snapdragon X over Core 7 Ultra. You can see all the results here. There's more wins for Snapdragon X over Core Ultra 7. But check this out. This is actually a screenshot during one of the tests I ran of Puget Bench running Photoshop 25.9, which is not supposed to look like this. So see all those black blocks on the screen? Those should not be there. It should be just basically a solid image. In fact, on the Core Ultra 7 laptop, it didn't. It looked perfectly. It looked like the photo, the NEF file that was being edited without these black blocks. But I got these weird black blocks running Photoshop on the Surface Laptop 7. I ran it multiple times. I restarted. In fact, I even deleted the assets for Puget Bench and reinstalled them to see if maybe they were corrupted in the download. But it just simply was weird. Is this a problem with Puget Bench? Is this a problem with Photoshop? I don't know, but it really made me wonder, well, if you are actually now taking this file that has these black blocks, is it fair? Are these black blocks basically not being processed the same as the actual image information that the Core Ultra 7 has to deal with? So even though technically Snapdragon X wins here, if you're getting these black blocks on the screen, you're like, and you're not actually processing those. Is it really a win? Is there something weird going on? So this really, I think, is a TBD. We'll have to see if this gets fixed eventually. But I don't know. I don't know what's going on. And honestly, that's the section where we have to get into sort of the weirdness of Snapdragon X and Windows on ARM, basically, because, Windows has traditionally been a 99.9% x86 world. And to run Windows on ARM, even though they've continued to toy with it for many, many years, they've never, ever really given up on it. There's still a lot of things don't work. And I'm going to show you in my direct experiences that things didn't work. First up, I really wanted to look at some AI performance using real world applications. Topaz Video AI has a built-in benchmark. I love Topaz products. I love Video AI because you can take things like low resolution wedding files from 20 years ago and upres them to 4K, and they look amazing. Not perfect, but believe me, it's a lot better than 720p. But trying to install it on the Surface Laptop 7, your CPU does not support AVX2. You could actually try to make the benchmark run. If you want to continue, I actually did that, but running it with it in emulated mode without AVX2 support, the Surface Laptop 7 got excessively hot. I decided to stop it because I just did not want to melt something. But overall, I was just afraid that it wasn't going to really work right. So again, that's a big negative for Snapdragon X and frankly, ARM on Windows, right? Windows on ARM is there's no AVX2, there's no AVX, and if the program needs it, that's just simply not going to work until they basically write a version that runs on Windows on ARM. And I'm not necessarily sure that every single vendor is going to do that if 99% of the world that they're going to sell to is based on x86. So you got to know that's there. This is Gigapixel AI. Same thing. You can use this to upsize low resolution files. Wonderful product. I love it. Your CPU must support AVX instructions to install this program. It won't even install. Right, so there's plenty of things that just simply won't install at all because there's no AVX in the actual Snapdragon X. There's no AVX in ARM chips. It doesn't exist. I will say on Mac, there is a version that Topaz has made to run on Mac, and there's no AVX. There's no AVX2 on Macs either. But obviously, the gravity that Mac OS and Apple has, Topaz, with content creation people, said, yeah, you know what? We got a lot of customers on Mac. We're going to do a version for M3, for M1, M2, right? We are going to support it. Are they going to go yeah, we're going to support that for Windows on ARM for the 20,000 Windows on ARM laptops that are going to be out there? I'm not so sure that's going to happen overnight. So you got to know it's there. And it doesn't just end here because look, I was installing Acrobat this is Acrobat Professional. I was installing it. I had Photoshop already running. It's oh, okay, Creative Cloud. If you actually fired up an x86, you can have this huge stable of Adobe products that run on x86. If you're trying to install on Windows on ARM, it's 3. One of this is hey, you can install Acrobat. It's not native, but you can install it. Well, kind of, sort of. I got this weird error where it was trying to point to a folder, ARM64 Vista. It didn't exist. And then what happened was it didn't install the Adobe Acrobat Pro print driver. So yes, I could still actually access Acrobat. I still was able to create Acrobat files, but I wasn't actually able to access the Adobe Acrobat print driver. I could access the Windows one, but not the Acrobat one. So again, and really, people were saying they were able to install Premiere on Windows on ARM. I couldn't do it. There are many, many things I just simply couldn't run on there, even though I don't know other reviewers have claimed they've done it. I have no doubt they did it, but for me, just simply trying to install it from Creative Cloud as a normal consumer would, it's a no-go. It was a no-go, and you got to know about this. Let's keep going. So one of the things I did is hey, you know what? Does Thunderbolt work? Because Snapdragon X basically has USB 4 support, and of course, the way Microsoft has written the rules for USB 4 on Windows, you basically have to have USB 4, the equivalent of Thunderbolt 4. So basically, you have to have NVMe support. You have to have Thunderbolt 3 support, essentially, Thunderbolt 4 support. And so, does it work? So I took my G drive. This is a Thunderbolt 3 drive. And I said, hey, let's plug it into the Surface Laptop 7. Worked perfectly fine on the ZenBook 14 OLED because it's got Thunderbolt 4 ports. No problems at all. Plugged it in. Hey, it worked. It actually showed up in the drive, and I could see my NTFS partition Really cool, right? So again, Thunderbolt 3, this is not Thunderbolt 4. It is also a native Thunderbolt 3 drive. It does not have this weird hybrid USB support. If you plug this into a pure USB port that does not have any Thunderbolt support, any NVMe support, it will not work. So that's why I love this drive to use. And it worked, kind of, because the problem is this drive actually comes from the factory with basically an NTFS partition and then also an HFS plus partition, which is basically if I got it right, it's basically the Mac file format that they use. And basically half the drive, or more than 80% of the drive, is formatted for HFS plus, because a lot of people content creation use Macs. They want you to be able to access it, no problem, because G Drive, they actually give you a free utility made by Paragon Software that lets you read HFS plus partitions. So on a Thunderbolt 4 or a Thunderbolt 3 laptop running Windows on x86, you plug this in, you install the free utility, voila, now I can see my Apple HFS plus partition, access it just fine like normal. Well, drivers can't be emulated, and the driver for HFS plus from Paragon Software on here did not work, which means I could format this as NTFS, it would work, or exFAT, it would work, but I could not obviously use that for HFS plus. And that's a problem if you want to share stuff with Macs for HFS plus. And it really just kind of, again, points out those kind of like show-stopping things that just are really going to bug you if you want to run Windows on ARM, right? And there's other people that are on the internet now that are just cataloging all the things that just simply do not work on Windows on ARM for Snapdragon X laptops. And HFS Plus from Paragon Software is one of those things. But good news is Thunderbolt 3 does work. Thunderbolt 4 works. And technically, eGPUs should work, but again, until you get drivers from AMD or you get drivers from NVIDIA, it ain't going to work. And it's probably going to take a while to get there. So, but technically it should work because, again, USB 4 on all of the Snapdragon X laptops should be the equivalent of basically Thunderbolt 4. If I read all the rules right, and I'm right so far. So we'll see. We're going to hope. But let's keep going because there are more problems here, right? So the Canon IJ Printer Assistant tool. So basically I have a Canon printer that I bought around Christmas. Got a great deal on it. I run it on wireless. I installed the native Windows driver. Worked fine. I could print from it. Here's a printer test page for my printer. Don't believe me? Check it out. Printed this on my actual Canon printer. No problems using the Windows driver. I could actually scan using the native Windows scan tool. No problem. However, a lot of people who buy printers, and frankly, most people who buy printers are kind of old school like me, they wouldn't install the Canon or Epson or HP drivers and all those kind of funky, horrible tools that they include to do all your scan tools so you can go in and tweak it the way you want. Well, those drivers are probably not going to see Windows on ARM support. And you can see that here where even though I got the printer to show up, I could print to it, I could scan to it, I could not get the Printer IJ Printer Assistant tool to work. And there's just a lot of things that I'm going to guess are not going to work. I could get, again, Windows drivers for my older Canon printer. I have multiple Canon printers. I got that to work. I even was able to install a PCL driver for a very old Brother printer I have, although the Brother printer was, in bad shape. The toner cartridges are all jammed up. I haven't used in a long time. But I could use that generic PCL driver from Windows itself, but I can guarantee you there's no Brother drivers. I've already seen people say there's no Brother drivers. If you want native support from the drivers and print utilities, those things are not going to work. And that's going to be a problem because, again, the people who really like printers tend to be pretty old school, and they want to use these things the way they always use them. So that's just going to bug people. And there's just other things like, check this out. This really shocked me because, again, Google went through all the trouble to produce a version of Chrome that runs on Windows on ARM perfectly, right? So a native ARM version for Windows, but they didn't bother to make a version of Google Drive. So I tried to install Google Drive and it doesn't work on the Surface Laptop 7 with Snapdragon X. It's like, what is going on here? Is Google going to make a version of Google Drive for Windows on ARM? I don't know. And I will tell you, going all the way back to the original Surface RT, running a Tegra NVIDIA chip, Google was not the best friends for Microsoft. They really did not want to help them out. There was no Gmail. There was no native Gmail client. There was no Google Maps client for Windows RT, for Windows on ARM. And to this day, there's no Google Drive. I'm sure there's still no native Google app for our Windows as well. So, I mean, this is a problem. Again, I can run Google Drive all day on an AMD or Intel laptop. And if you run Google Drive and you cannot stand the fact that you cannot install it on Windows on ARM, you really need to think about whether you want to buy one of these laptops. So I know this sounds pretty scary, but again, you got to know before you get here. Go out. If you're something you cannot live without, go out and see if somebody's installed it on Windows on ARM, if they had any luck, and see if it works. So I do recommend you do that. So that's a reality check for people who want to do that. But let's keep going, because maybe there's some surprises. And, this other surprise, because I've seen actual benchmarks from people running the Blender benchmark. I've seen other reviewers do it. I've seen other people claim to have the results. Again, I don't doubt it, but for me, I downloaded the Blender benchmark launcher. I could not run Blender 4.1. I could not run Blender 4.0. I basically gave up and then downloaded Blender 4.1, ran it emulated. But Blender, even though people who currently have run it, did not work for me. It downloaded. I tried to download it and then errored out. So what's up there? I don't know. I cleared the cache. I tried to retry. No go. So again, there's just a lot of things that you need to know may not work. So make sure you check it out before you go there. So just be aware. But again, hey, here's some good news. I was like, okay, well, old school people, they run TurboTax. They run TurboTax on the client because they don't trust the cloud. Like me, I downloaded TurboTax 2022. That's actually a version that I downloaded quite a while before. It's sitting on my x86 desktop. Copied that file over, installed TurboTax 2022. It downloaded the latest version of it. Ran just fine. So there's some things that run just fine in using the Prism emulation. Like this to me is good news. This is like TurboTax is about as old school as you can get, and it works. I mean, probably the people who are running TurboTax are probably not going to be running Google Drive or running the Blender benchmark. So that's actually a good sign. There are plenty of things that run fine. Again, earlier you saw my performance results in Lightroom Classic, and then TurboTax runs. So there's some old school stuff that worked just fine. And also, this is the crazy old school thing. It's like, hey, can I play a DVD? So I downloaded VLC. It was running emulated. I verified that in the Task Manager, but I was able to play the Blues Brothers extended version on this funky old school Blu-ray drive that I have. Even though it's just a DVD drive, it worked just fine. So I could run both of those on the Surface Laptop 7 playing a DVD. Like, who the hell is going to buy a Surface Laptop 7, beautiful laptop, and then plug a DVD drive into it? Well, you can do it. And here you see the proof of the menu of the Blues Brothers extended version. Great movie, by the way, running on the Surface Laptop 7. So it's not all bad news. It's not all bad news. Just make sure you do your research. Just don't buy it and assume it's going to work. But, there's plenty of things that surprise me. Again, you can play DVD and play and run TurboTax and actually get better performance doing exports and RAW files and JPEGs out of Lightroom Classic. So don't assume it's all bad. Don't assume it's all bad. That's my PSA here. But let's get back to the benchmark. Let's keep going because this one's actually very important. Let's lean into the battery life because I know a lot of people go like, well, what's the battery life going to be like on these ARM laptops? Because I know ARM is better than x86. Of course, Intel would disagree with you greatly with Lunar Lake on power efficiency. We'll see when we get there, but everybody is of the firm belief that ARM is simply better than x86 in efficiency. And the way that I'd gauge that is using UL Procyon Office. Now, there are many, many different ways to gauge battery performance on a laptop. Not all of them everybody agrees with. I've done things from looping video, local files, to streaming video. I've tried different browsing benchmarks. There's all kinds of different ways to do it. And unfortunately, there is really no right way or wrong way to do it. You just simply have to understand that a result you see and then try to apply that to how you would care. So again, if I am, I really like to watch videos on a plane and I pay for the cheap seats. There's no power. I don't get the power. So I really do want to get excessive video rundown time, and I'm going to be watching videos that I've downloaded off the internet on the flight. that is a valid use case scenario for that person. So there really is no wrong way to do it. But I also realize that in modern day, all of these SoCs, these chips have hardware circuits that will decode video and basically make it so they are running on cruise control using the minimum amount of power all day. So you can truly get 25 hours, 26 hours, 22 hours of runtime doing video rundown tests. So it's real, again, if that applies, that scenario applies to you, but I want to try something a little closer to reality. So I use UL Procyon Office. I've actually tried to simulate this in the past where I would loop UL Procyon Office. The nice thing is they've actually built this into the benchmark now where it does it on its own. So it runs Word, PowerPoint, Office, and Excel, and it again runs them through real scenarios, actually going through, and if you watch it, it launches all four of them. They're all running at the same time. It alt tabs between them, which is the way people do it. You don't close out a Word and then start Excel. You simply minimize it. We all do that. So it'll go through the application. It'll type something. It'll go into Excel. It'll edit the Excel document, edit the PowerPoint, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see it's a very real world experience. One thing I do want to tell you, though, is actually observing the benchmark. There's also an awful lot of screw around time, which is it goes into Excel, goes into PowerPoint, Word, and then it basically walks away and probably watches a Netflix show. Like, frankly, everybody working from home, everybody does that. They go and watch a Netflix show on the TV for an hour, then they come back. So there's an awful lot of downtime in Procyon Office. It's not like somebody sitting there in front of the computer working 9 hours straight in Office. There really is quite a bit of downtime. It is also run at 200 nits, which I consider a reasonable brightness. It's not too dim, it's not too bright, and in my living room, in my dining room, I can actually look at the screen and it's not too dark and that it's useless. So this is what UL Procyon Office runs. And it runs it continuously at the end. It basically gives you total runtime. I ran this, all of the previous tests, for the most part, were run on the best performance settings available on the laptop. This was run on balanced for the Asus and run on recommended power profile for the Surface Laptop 7 because my feeling is like, well, you really don't need all that power when you're just simply doing, Excel and stuff and you're unplugged from the wall. So most people are going to be running in the balanced or recommended power modes anyway, and for the laptops. And frankly, they don't even know to switch. But so that's how I ran it. And you can see we're seeing roughly 10 and a half hours for the Core Ultra 7 in the ZenBook 14 with its 75 watt-hour battery. Not a bad showing. Again, there's a lot of goof off time in here, but that is not bad. 10 plus hours running Office. And I actually did, during the test, look at the amount of power impact on the battery. And, it does spike up. It is actually using the SoC quite a bit. So it's just simply not sitting there idling at 5 watts the entire time. It'll spike up to 10 to 20 watts and 15, 30 watts. So it is doing something. But we're getting a couple more hours out of the Snapdragon X Elite and the Surface Laptop 7. And when you consider, again, 54 watt-hour battery versus 75 watt-hour battery, roughly 28, 30% bigger battery, that's a solid win for Snapdragon X. The real caveat, though, is the ZenBook 14 has that OLED panel. UL Procyon it overrides dark mode, so it is running Office using a white background, which simply uses more power. So the ZenBook 14 OLED, even though it has a bigger battery, is at a disadvantage there with that OLED panel. However, overall, I would say 12 and a half hours versus 10 and a half hours is a nice solid win. And this isn't simply one run. I probably ran this test 10 times doing different power settings, doing different settings on the laptops just to see what it is. And for the most part, it was solidly 10 and a half to 12 and a half hours on both of these laptops almost all the time. So very, very good showing. You're not seeing magical. You didn't see the Snapdragon X Elite and Surface Laptop get twice the amount of battery life that I think some people might have expected, sort of seeing these video rundown tests because oh my God, these are crazy amount of runtime. But again, if you're sitting there actually using the laptop, even though there's a lot of goof off time, if I could get 12 to 10 hours using Office, going and watching, a Netflix show on my TV, for an hour, a couple times a day, then I would say I'd be pretty happy with that. So, but again, 10.5 to 12.5 is pretty solid performance out of these. Win for Snapdragon X, but you're not going to get a super duper battery life that people may have claimed in the run up to the launch of Snapdragon X. So there might be some disappointment there, but if I got 12.5 hours running Office all day, I think that's enough, because I would want to put that laptop away and stop working and go screw around and actually get on with my life. So there will be more on actual real world battery testing at the end, but let's keep going, looking at some other tests. Okay, so one thing that I do want to point out is, again, so you saw that we got 12.5 hours out of Snapdragon X. We got 10.5 out of Core Ultra 7. But one nice thing that UL Procyon Office does is, like, beyond also telling you how long it ran, it actually gives you a performance rating. So this is the median performance of both these laptops. It basically, every time it does something in Office, it actually measures how long it takes, and then it gives you the performance ratings for these. And you could see a significant performance advantage for Snapdragon X Elite. We're looking at a solid 66% increase in performance for the Surface Laptop 7 over that ZenBook 14 OLED. Part of that is probably, again, because we're coming from running in balanced power for the ZenBook 14, recommended power for the Snapdragon X on the Surface Laptop 7. So these are not where you try to light the SoC on fire. You basically want to lean that battery life on. You want that other thing. But what I can tell you is this actually is a way to tell you, if I actually click on an application on Snapdragon X on the Surface Laptop 7, using a device, I have a device that lets me click on the same icons, launch everything using the same mouse for both, so basically launching them at the same time, you could visibly see the Snapdragon X was snappier. It was just simply crisper. It just simply responded faster. Things popped up on the screen faster. Things just simply came up faster on the Surface Laptop 7 than it did on the ZenBook 14 OLED, because when you are running the balanced power setting on battery on the Intel Meteor Lake, it looks to me like they're basically, scaling back, pushing that CPU very, very hard in order to sort of lean the battery life out. And what that ends up meaning is it's just simply less responsive than the Snapdragon X Elite. Is it enough to change your world? Probably not, but again, I could visibly see it using the device I used to launch all the applications, where Snapdragon X Elite was just simply faster than Core Ultra 7, just doing things set to the balanced and recommended power profiles, which is how most people run it. And you're seeing this in UL Procyon Office, where 66% is a lot of performance left on the table. And if you just simply want that snappy feel, Snapdragon X Elite is going to give that to you over Core Ultra 7 in these two laptops. So that is, to me, a very, very big win. Again, you're getting better battery life despite having a smaller battery. Again, OLED, we know OLED is there. And you're also getting a snappier performance. So I would say in battery performance, this is a big win for Snapdragon X. Again, you need to stick around to the end of this video, because there is a lot more to unpack on actual real-world impacts of battery usage. This isn't the end of the story here, but again, using an actual benchmark measuring battery life and measuring the performance, Snapdragon X, snappier, more responsive, and also better battery life. Not a huge amount, but again, that's with a smaller battery. So I would say this is a solid win for Snapdragon X over Core Ultra 7. So let's keep going, though, because there's more to talk about. Okay, so this is a fun one. It's actually very hard to look at the power consumption of these laptops, because a lot of the tools simply don't work on Windows on ARM. So I wanted to do some measurements of how much power these laptops would use when they were plugged into the wall, which I thought was pretty fair. Because so what I did is I took both of these laptops, I swapped out their stock chargers for basically the matching GAN, 100-watt GAN Electek 100-watt chargers. I actually considered using an Apple charger, but the ones I have don't have a 15-volt rail. I wanted to use one that had a 15-volt rail, so I used these 100-watt GAN chargers. I only had them, they were multi-port chargers, but only had them plugged into one port. I use the exact same Apple, because Apple makes fantastic cables, believe it or not. They actually do make really, really good cables. I use actually matching Apple USB-C to USB-C cables in both of those. I plugged both of those into the laptops, and then I used the PowerZ, matching PowerZ USB-C meters to read the amount of power going into both laptops over the USB-C ports. I also pulled it at 10 samples per second, which is an awful lot. And I also want to point out, for people who don't know, the stock charger for the Surface Laptop 7 is 39 watts. That is simply an undersized charger for that laptop. And we'll get into a little bit more, because that laptop will actually use in excess of 50 watts if you are using a charger that can give more power, and that's using it on 20. So basically, if I had a Surface Laptop 7 and I just simply wanted it to charge faster, I would personally buy a 65 watt charger that it charges on the 20 volt rail. So you want 20 volts, and then you up to 3 amps, and you basically want 3 amps and 20 volts on a 60 watt charger to give you it. But again, so what I'm doing in this chart here is I'm actually measuring the power going into the laptop. Both laptops are charged up to 100%. The brightness on both of them were set the same. They basically were set up the same way in both of these. And then I went ahead and I fired up Chrome and I ran WebExpert. And I liked WebExpert because it is a very light load. Most browsing benchmarks tend to be very, very light. And so again, we are reading the amount of power the laptops are using at the wall. And because the batteries are full, they don't draw from the battery. So basically what the laptops generally do is they draw from the USB-C charger, and it sort of gives you a good approximation for how much power the laptop will be using. And again, the problem with it is total system power, because you're counting the RAM, you're counting the motherboard, the VRMs, the SSD, and the screen. Again, we are looking at an OLED versus an IPS panel, but it's total system laptop power that you're using at the wall when you're running this one benchmark. And you can see in blue, because blue is Intel, where you start off at about 8 to 9 watts overall, but we kick up very Intel-like, where it kicks up to 40 watts. You get to these very spiky things. Intel generally likes to go for very high spikes. If they're running on AC, they basically like to boost up as high as they can. Look at this. Even though it's a very light load, we're seeing 55 watts, 56 watts. A lot of these really high peaks where you're pushing up into 50 watts for the Intel part. And for the most part, you can see this concentration of the blue lines here. It's just simply, generally, not bad, because there's, it's very light load. You're only using a single core for the most part. 8 to 9 watts overall, but you can see the density does push up into that teens, into 18, 19, 20, and we see a lot of those peaks going up to 30 to 40 watts. So overall, you're just simply using more power running the WebExpert 4 on Chrome for the total laptop power of the OLED of the ZenBook 14 OLED than you are the Surface Laptop 7. Because look, the Surface Laptop 7 with the Snapdragon X, you basically start your idle around 5 watts, and you sort of start peaking. You don't get the crazy high peaks that you do with Intel. We get a couple that maybe get up into the mid 30s here, but for the most part, you're using less than 10 watts running this very, very light Chrome based WebExpert benchmark. And I would say for the most part, the density of this looks like it's mostly, I should have done an average. Unfortunately, I didn't. But for the most part, you're pushing about 8 to 9 watts across the full range. And then for Intel, you're definitely pushing, 10 watts across it. But a lot of these very high peaks, very high spike things that I've seen from Intel over the years. So again, this is an imperfect way to look at power usage of these laptops, but at least gives us an idea of what it's going to look like, because again, we are using matching chargers, matching cables. I'm running the same brightness across both of these. Obviously, I'm using an ARM version of Chrome versus an x86 version of Chrome, and yeah, one has OLED, and maybe one motherboard is less efficient. Maybe the fans are kicked up a little bit more on the other one, but for the most part, I would say Intel just using a little more power than the Snapdragon X overall for this WebExpert 4 benchmark. So that's very much real at the wall. Let's keep going. What else we got? Gordon? Okay, so here's a little something tougher. So again, WebExpert 4, very lightweight browser benchmark. Mostly single-threaded. Again, you saw for the most part, 10, 15 watts, under 10 for the Snapdragon. Let's try something a little harder. So we're doing the exact same thing, matching GAN chargers, same brightness. set to high power here, and we see that the blue is the Intel, and you will push up, again, this is an all-core load, so rather than just simply using single core, single threaded in the WebExpert, the Intel part will push up to in excess of 60 watts at the wall. Again, you're drawing this from the GAN charger. Yes, and again, it is total system power, but most of this is likely being eaten by the SoC because it's being tasked to do an all-core render in Cinebench 2024, and you can see we're pushing up to in excess of 60 watts, 62 watts, and then what happens is it's going for a little while, and then it goes like, oh, you know what? We're going to crank this down because we can't run this. We can't push it this hard across the full range. So now it drops down to about 53, 54 watts, and then we start slowly kind of dropping down as the heat builds up in the laptop. The SoC kind of gets warmer and warmer and warmer, and for the most part, finishes the entire run at about 40 watts, 42 watts, right? Orange is Snapdragon X, and a little bit of a shock because I have run this on Macs, and they generally are super power efficient. And I don't think I've ever seen a Mac get up this high. I'll have to try. And again, I'm running this a different way. I didn't have 2024 on the Mac, so different kettle of fish. But the fact that we are seeing Snapdragon X when we're pushing all 12 cores up to 55 watts is that's a lot of power for an ARM chip, right? He's like, oh, well, but again, you are pushing 12 cores. And then it's sort of like, okay, we're going to back off of this. And interestingly, we're going to see this elsewhere here. It basically runs up at about 55 watts. It backs off all the way down to about 45 watts. And then it says like, hey, this ain't stopping. Let's actually try to crank it up. Let's get a little more performance. I think this could, maybe a little bit of power tuning because you would expect it, like Intel, basically, you would expect it to basically start off high, and then we sort of back off to like 52 watts, and then we continue to back off as the sort of heat builds up, and it just slowly backs off. To me, it's a little odd to actually go under the power consumption and then back up. I would expect it to stay high and drop off. It should drop off gradually for the best performance out of here. But so basically, we drop down to about 45 watts, and then it climbs up to about 50 watts, and then it starts dropping off again down to about 48 watts. We get a little bit of peak here, but for the most part, we'll follow the orange line. It actually closely matches the Meteor Lake H for the most part across the range. And then what happens here is the Snapdragon X finishes the actual Cinebench run, and Cinebench says, okay, you're done. Go do something. So the Snapdragon X goes, okay, go read the paper. And now we drop back down to idle. And then Windows starts doing a lot of house cleaning stuff. So it's idling. And then typically when you have all of the CPU completely bogged down doing stuff and it's finally, idle and it's doing nothing, Windows will start doing house cleaning chores. Like this big spike here probably says, Windows says, hey, why don't you go take care of this? So it cranks up to 40 watts, drops back down, and a lot of these spikes from here. But the thing is, clearly, Snapdragon X finishes the test sooner than the Meteor Lake chip. And again, because the Meteor Lake chip is running all the way out here until it finally finishes, and then it drops off to its idle point. So, again, I would say overall, the power consumption is pretty high. I did not expect it to be this high for an ARM part because, ARM, everybody says, is amazingly efficient. But again, one thing you do have to factor is how much faster it is, and it actually ended up being faster. You saw the performance results in the original slide. We can go all the way back to slide 1 if we want to, but, it actually gives you, I'll read off my results. We're looking at basically, roughly 27 to 30% better performance out of the Snapdragon X, and it actually finishes sooner than the Meteor Lake part. But for the most part, it actually uses the same amount of power as a Meteor Lake running Cinebench 2024, which is kind of a shock. Again, this is running at the wall. This is running at high performance, best performance on both of these platforms. But it feels like an Intel chip rather than what I've sort of experienced with Mac chips or M3, M2 chips. And I do want to say I've, of course, not tested modern Apple chips, but kind of a surprise. It's still faster, though, again. So solid win for Snapdragon X, but this does give you an idea of how much Qualcomm is not afraid to use that power. They every single Snapdragon X laptop I've seen has a fan in them. Yes, the laptop makers can tune them to use less power. They can even make fanless versions of them, but that probably means giving up more performance. And it looks like in this first round, they are just simply swinging for the fences if they are plugged into the wall and you want max performance out of them. So that looks like what we're getting out of here. So let's keep going. What else can we see, Gordon? Okay, next one is single-threaded performance. So previously you saw Cinebench running all cores. So now we're going to run the same thing. We're only going to run one core because, again, you're looking at, 16 cores in Meteor Lake versus 12 cores in Snapdragon X. Different core builds and etc. But let's look at it if we only use one single core in Cinebench 2024. Again, blue line is Intel, and we basically, for the most part, are running about 30, 31 watts across the entire full range. Something goes on here. I think it basically finishes rendering that frame, starts over again, and that's probably what we're seeing it kind of like crank up and use a little bit more power. But for the most part, for a single core, single thread, you're looking at about 30 watts across the full range for Meteor Lake. For Snapdragon X, it looks like on a single core, total system power. Remember, total system power. We're not only looking at the SoC because it is. I have not found a way to track only the SoC easily, but looking at 18 to 19 watts out of the Snapdragon X Elite for single core performance, and then basically again it does finish sooner than the Meteor Lake. It goes into idle, and then we have again that house cleaning that you're seeing going on. And let me read you the performance if we actually want to look at the performance here, because that does matter because they are using roughly, so Snapdragon X is using roughly 18, 19 watts across the range versus, 28, 29 for Meteor Lake, 30 watts. The single-threaded, single-core performance I recorded previously was 123 for Snapdragon X Elite versus 104. So 18% improvement in performance for Snapdragon X while using less power. So that's, to me, a big win for Snapdragon X. So yes, in a single core performance, it's doing better, right? It's just simply outperforming it. So that's a real win for Snapdragon X. But again, it's not afraid to use the power. But single core performance is definitely doing nicer, right? That is a pretty good showing for Snapdragon X here in performance. But let's keep going. Is there anything else we could see? Okay. So one of the problems with running at the wall is, it's like, is there another way I could sort of at least get a look at how these things behave? And so I know running the laptops plugged into the wall and then using the consumed power with the batteries charged up to 100% is one way to do it. It is still an imperfect way to do it, but it does give us an idea of the sort of how these things kind of react. Again, Snapdragon X is not afraid to swing for the fences if it has power access to the wall. And of course, we also are seeing a better efficiency because it is simply using, a third less power than Meteor Lake using a single core for Cinebench runs, and it's still giving you 18% more performance. So that's a big win. But you know what? For this test, what I basically said is like, let's look at the impact on battery. So let's take Geekbench 6.3. I'm basically running this on both laptops unplugged from the wall, and I actually track the power consumption of the laptops, the impact on the battery using Passmark's BatteryMon. So I could log the actual power impact, one sample per second. So I could see here we see for Meteor Lake, we get up to like maybe 9 milliwatts, 9,000 milliwatts, or basically 9 watts. Here we get up to 10 watts. We get up to 15 watts. And you can see basically for the most part, this is the actual impact on the battery. This actually does matter because, when you are taking power out of the battery, you have less battery life, right? So the more you push that battery, the more you basically drain your gas tank, the less you're going to have left to run the laptop. So the Intel laptop is interestingly kind of running the way I would expect Intel to run. I've seen this in the past. I have not, this frankly, again, for me, Meteor Lake is new to me. I've not been able to test it. This is my first Meteor Lake, but it looks like very Intel-like because basically what happens is, if you don't know, Geekbench does about a dozen different things like JPEG compression, JPEG decompression, text compression, ray trace performance, all kinds of different things. So a dozen different things. So it starts a thing, finishes, it does something else. And we're kind of seeing that where what happens with Intel is it sort of cranks up. Okay, we're going to use up to 9,000 milliwatts. We're going to use up to 10,000 milliwatts. We're going to use up to 15,000 milliwatts, 15 watts, right? We're going to use it to 20. But what happens in between each one of these is like, hey, it's done. So one of the things that Intel has done in the past, going all the way back to Tiger Lake and before, is like, you're done with this task. Get on the gas. Get on the brakes. So you get on the gas, finish it as fast as you can. Now you're done. Get on the brakes because you want to stop, because if you can get that chip down to idle, you can save power. And we can sort of see that where we get up to, 13, 14,000 milliwatts, and then it just drops down to idle. Crank up to, 15 milliwatts, get down to idle, right? 5,000 milliwatts, 5 watts. Crank up to 20,000 milliwatts, get back to idle. So it's very Intel-like, where you just kind of like, boop, 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 do this, get on the, like, gas, brake, gas, brake, gas, brake. And I've seen this with Tiger Lake, where it just kind of cranks up and down as it goes along. And then if you don't know, again, Geekbench typically, first half of it is the single-threaded performance. Second half is generally the multi-threaded performance. So now we're using more power. So that's why we sort of peak at about, under 15 watts, which is a good showing for Meteor Lake here overall. Not bad. We do see that one peak up at 20 watts. But when you start to hit all the cores, 35 watts, 40 watts, 46, 47 watts, 40 watts. So definitely, again, Intel getting like all those cores firing up, using a lot more power. And then when it's done, getting on the brakes, dropping all the way back down to zero, right? Because that's very Intel-like. So when you look at Snapdragon, it's a little more different. So it's almost like an AMD chip. I've seen AMD chips kind of do this before, where they really don't seem to have this start-stop thing as much as possible. They don't sort of like get on the brakes and jam it back down to idle as much. And for the most part, the Snapdragon X doesn't idle as quickly as the Meteor Lake part, at least from what I can see. Again, I'm only polling at 1 sample per second. Maybe if I could increase the poll rate on the battery, it would look a little different. But it's showing up on Intel. It's not showing up on Snapdragon, where it's dropping back to that idle power. But for the most part, still Snapdragon X is very well behaved, where we're well under 10 watts in all of the single threaded performance. As we get up to multi-threaded, 15 watts. Occasionally up to, we're peaking up over 20 watts, but for the most part, we're under 15 watts, which is well under what you're sort of these high peaks. That's just going to use a lot of power for Intel. And so I would say overall, it's a win for Meteor Lake, because again, I mean, it's a win for Snapdragon because overall you're just going to use less power. And then also there's a performance question too, because there is a performance component to Geekbench. I don't always run Geekbench, and again, so this is the same test that you saw earlier. The actual performance for Snapdragon X in the Surface Laptop is better, right? 14,754. That's about 16% better performance out of Snapdragon X. And single-threaded performance, single-core performance, 2,800 versus 2,300. Again, that's about 18% more performance out of Snapdragon X than you are getting out of Meteor Lake for both of these. So not only are you generally using a little less power, you are also getting more performance out of Snapdragon X. So again, sort of matching what we saw out of those wall power usages. It's a solid win for Snapdragon. And I actually went ahead and let's add it up to what its actual watts. So I added up. If you add up all the milliwatt strain, it works out to about 3,462 watts. So about 34 watts, 30 versus 3797 watts for Meteor Lake. So not a huge difference, about 10% more power for Meteor Lake over Snapdragon. But again, you're getting, about 16% more performance in multi-core. You're getting 18% more in single core. And you're also using about 10% less power than you are out of Intel. That's on battery. That's not at the wall. And that's the impact on the battery itself at the end. So that, again, this points to a solid win for Snapdragon X over Core Ultra 7. So I would count that as a win there overall. Let's keep going. So again, let's look at something a little more fixed. Again, one of the problems with Geekbench is it's hitting you with all kinds of different tests. JPEG compression, HTML compression, it does a lot of different things. It's not constant. So here I use Cinebench 2024 all-core performance, and I'm looking at the milliwatts drain on the battery again. The one thing that is different with Cinebench is it is rendering a frame, so it is only doing one thing, although it's not doing the only thing because the frame does change. But we can see for Meteor Lake, we crank it all the way up to about 47, 48, 49, up to 50 watts impact on the battery before it going, okay, let's crank it down because this ain't gonna last. So Intel basically backs all the way down to about 38 watts and then continues on for most of the run. Does something here, possibly resetting the frame. I'm not sure. Who knows? But for the most part, 39 to 40 watts while running Cinebench 2024. Now let's look at Snapdragon X, and you can see Snapdragon X is like, hey, again, we see this weird thing where like it cranks all the way up to about 15 watts and then it just drops down and then it climbs back up for the stars, which is, again, I don't think the most efficient way to do that. I would expect it to climb all the way up like what Intel does and then back off and then sort of like slowly waterfall off as you're going on. For this, it's a little odd where you climb at 15 watts, you drive down to 8 watts, and then it goes, oh, we're still working? Okay, let's drive up to 40 watts. You would get better performance if you simply always, you climbed up and then dropped, in my opinion. We'll see. Again, these are early days. It is tuned by each vendor for how they do it. But as we go on and we're running Cinebench, the Snapdragon X goes like, hey, let's drop down. This is going to be a pretty long load. We need to settle in. And basically, for the most part, you are running the entire test at about 28 watts, right, across the board. So we go 28 watts across the board, finishes, drops off to idle, versus about 39 to 38 watts for Meteor Lake. So again, that's a healthy savings, and I would say that's a win for Snapdragon from the power consumption side. And I do want to point out this weirdness where, interestingly, Cinebench stops here because clearly what happens is the Meteor Lake laptop is done, goes into idle, and basically starts doing some house cleaning stuff. And Snapdragon X actually doesn't finish to all the way here. And you say like, oh, well, that's because Snapdragon X takes longer to finish. It got a lower score. Actually, no, it actually got a better score than actual Meteor Lake, but it took longer. Now, this is one of the sort of weirdnesses about Cinebench. Like I said before, it runs for a minimum of 10 minutes. And then what happens is if you get to about 10 minutes and you're still rendering a frame, say like you're 10% into rendering that frame, it will make you continue to render that entire frame until you're done. So this could be like 2 frames rendered or 3 frames rendered, but it just continues on to run. What I think happened here is Meteor Lake basically finished the frame right about here at the same time that the benchmark completed that 10-minute run. So that's probably what happened. And I can tell you that this also is kind of this weirdness like, oh, Gordon, you just simply started these at the wrong time. They're not lined up. And I will say they're the same thing because I use, again, the same mouse to kick both of these benchmarks off at the same time. So these are actually matching start times. So this is probably what explains here. And also I want to explain that if you're kind of wondering what's going on. So I got to do that. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so again, here we go. So this is the result. So this is running basically the power, and then this is the result. And this is running balanced recommended power, basically 713 for Snapdragon X. So again, better performance, and also using less power, and so solid win over Core Ultra 7, where simply Meteor Lake is an improvement over Raptor Lake, but it's just simply not enough in power consumption over Snapdragon X Elite. So better performance and simply at less power than we're seeing out of Meteor Lake is, again, what the results are here. All right, last one here, I hope. And same thing, we're doing the same test where we're looking at milliwatts. This is a drain doing the Excel recalculation. So normally it takes 8 to 9 minutes. It's actually on battery, though it stretches out to like 10 or 12 minutes. And we can see again, running Excel, again, is a very memory intensive and also a very core intensive. We will use all the threads available on both of these platforms. And we are, for the most part, pushing on Intel up above 50 watts. You saw a similar sort of pattern with Cinebench. And we see 40 watts for the most across the entire run. Finishes the run. Bam, it's done. Snapdragon X, about 30 watts. 33 watts, 35 watts, and it drops down to about 28, 29 watts, finishes the run. And this is running basically at the default recommended power setting, as well as balanced on the Core Ultra 7. And the actual performance is, again, previously Intel was faster, and when you're running on battery, that actually opens up a little bit more. We sort of see, again, it does save less power, but it takes longer to finish this because it continues to run it. So the actual performance score running this Excel recalc and intensive recalc is better for ZenBook than it is for the, and basically the tune of about 17% less time to finish this than it is for the Snapdragon X Elite. So not always a win for Snapdragon X. And again, previously, Core Ultra 7 was slightly faster when you're running both of these laptops on basically their sort of default power modes. It actually opens up a little more, favoring Core Ultra 7 for this one Excel remark test. Okay, so that's pretty much it for all the power insights that I've done, all the performance insights. Again, I would say, for the most part, you're in general getting better performance out of Snapdragon X. You're in general getting better battery performance, better power efficiency out of Snapdragon X. Doesn't always work out to be that case, as you can see, but obviously there's also the caveats where things just simply don't work on Windows on ARM when you're running emulated. So that's something you need to know about. But this last section I want to talk about because I think it's very valuable, because battery life is a big component of Snapdragon X. It's a big component of ARM versus x86 arguments, because everybody is absolutely sure that ARM is more efficient than x86. And again, there are, as I said earlier, there are valid reasons why you would do a video rundown test. There are valid reasons why you would do an Office rundown test. There are valid reasons why you might try to do a synthetic scripted, browsing benchmark test. But one problem when you are doing battery rundown tests on a laptop, and I've faced this for decades because I've looked at this problem, trying to solve it for many, many years. There is simply no easy way to ever solve it because, again, some people may want basically video rundown tests. Some people may want a browsing test. Some people may want using Office. Some people may want to use open source applications. Some people may want to say like, hey, I want you to drive these things as hard as you can using, a 3D rendering test, or doing doing a handbrake encode, or doing ink. So there's so many different ways you can push these things, and the results are always going to be different. And I can tell you, if you're running Cinebench 2024 on a Surface Laptop 7, or you're running it on a Galaxy Book, or you're running it on an HP OmniBook or a Dell XPS, the performance is going to generally be fairly close, because if they all have the same SoC, if you have a Core Ultra 7, a Core Ultra 9, a Snapdragon X, an AMD Ryzen 9, Ryzen 7, the performance in Cinebench is going to be pretty damn close to what you get out of those platforms, because that is that one benchmark. If you try to do battery, though, it's going to be very different, because if I tell somebody, hey, on the Surface Laptop 7 with this Snapdragon X Elite, I got 12 and a half hours of Office runtime at 200 nits. And again, I ran that benchmark 8 or 9 different times. So I can tell you it is completely repeatable, and that's what you will get. You will get 10 and a half hours on a Meteor Lake laptop in the ZenBook 14 OLED. Okay, they'll go like, oh, wow, that's awesome. I'm going to get this incredible battery life. 12 and a half hours, 10 and a half hours, that's definitely better than what I'm getting out of my 6-year-old laptop, Gordon. So they go out, they run to the store, they buy one of these laptops, they bring it home, and they're using it, and they say like, hey, you lied to me. I'm not getting 12 and a half hours. I'm not getting 10 and a half hours. I'm getting way less battery life performance than you are getting. What's up with that? Or if you go to the internet and you will read somebody says like, hey, I am getting 2 days of battery life out of this. And then somebody in the next post will say like, I'm getting 6 hours of battery life out of this. And then, of course, classically, somebody with a Mac will go like, my thing runs for a week. I run it for days. The battery lasts forever, right? What does this even mean? Like, how exactly can everybody be right? How can everybody's experience with battery life be so different that none of it ever matches? And it feels like everybody is either lying or telling fish stories. But I can tell you that most people that are using it, that's their experience, because if they're only getting, you know, 3 or 4 hours of battery life out of it, that's what they're getting. In fact, I was just talking to my wife today. She's like, yeah, if I'm sitting outside, screen is cranked up, Wi-Fi's terrible, this is at work, I'll be lucky to get 4 hours of battery life out of it. And what laptop is she using? She's using a MacBook M2 Air. You will go to the internet and people will swear to God that the MacBook M2 Air will like last days and days and days. And I've also seen times where my wife is like, she's using her MacBook M2 Air and she gets a couple days of use out of it. So what I'm really saying is like, this is a mess. It is a very huge mess, and it is very hard for people to try to determine what's better battery life. You know, OEMs try to use benchmarks like MobileMark, where it basically runs it through, you know, an Office or open source task or a lot of tasks where it sort of simulates, you know, real world usage. And they also do video rundown tests, and everybody's trying to come up with something that matches real world, but it's different for everybody. So I don't know what the easy answer is here, but I will tell you, I was trying to get to the truth. And one way I decided to try to do that is to use the same device that I do a lot of testing with. And it's made by Huntech. It's called a Sync Monster, and it basically lets you control multiple devices with the same mouse and keyboard. So I basically plug one mouse, one keyboard into this thing. Out of it feeds multiple USB cables. I plug one into the Surface Laptop 7. I plug one into the ZenBook 14 OLED. And then when I move that mouse on both of those laptops, the cursor moves around with it. If I click the Photoshop icon and I launch it, Photoshop launches on both of those at the same time, as though I clicked on it on both of those at the same time. If I type on both of those, it types on both of those. So it is as though you are sitting at those laptops and you are using them at the same time. So, well, okay, let's try to use this tool to evaluate real world performance. So what I did is I took my Sync Monster, plugged them into both laptops, charged them up to full charge, set them both again to 200 nits, and then I proceeded to try to use them in a real world manner. So my definition of real world is actually real world. I wanted to try to make it as real as possible. For this first test, I basically plugged in matching Apple earbuds into both of those. And by the way, both of them were charged up to 100%. So I plugged in earbuds to both of those because I wanted to minimize the impact of the speaker systems. Because when you are running if one laptop has a louder speaker subsystem than the other louder speaker subsystem, it's not free. It costs more power. So hopefully by using the same earbuds, it helps. I set the volume the same using my head to equalize it, and I didn't use any tools for that, but it equalizes it more than using an actual speaker. So I did that for both of those. I was using there's a USB plugged into it for the mouse and keyboard, and also one thing I wanted to try to do was minimize the impact of Wi-Fi, because my fear was the distance from the router to the laptops and then other Wi-Fi devices. If you have one laptop that is driving the Wi-Fi radio a little harder, it's going to use more power. So I wanted to eliminate that. So both of those were actually using USB gigabit Ethernet adapter, matching USB gigabit Ethernet adapters on both of those as well. So for the first run, I basically so Wi-Fi was off using a gigabit Ethernet adapter. I verified the internet was basically the same on both of them. They are basically 1 gigabit asymmetric up and down, and I set both of them to their available power settings, best efficiency for the ASUS, and I also set I set the ASUS for balanced power, and then I set the Surface Laptop to recommended. So then I started to basically use the laptop the way I would expect it to. So I did actually install Zoom on both of those. I did a short Zoom call on both of those, about 10 minutes. I had Zoom installed on both of them. I also, for the Zoom call, that was about 10 minutes, I used the built-in Windows Studio effects with eye contact and the background blur and portrait blur on and auto framing on both of those laptops. I actually had a third laptop that sent the invite to both those laptops, and then I stared at both between those laptops, and I had them run for about 10 minutes doing a Zoom call. And then when I was finished with the call, I minimized Zoom, and then I went to the normal thing that you would do, which was browsing. So now what I did is I started to browse. I fired up Google Chrome on both of those, and I went to multiple websites. I went to PC World, I went to Macworld, I went to Tech Advisor, PC Welt, Tech Hive, so a lot of my sister magazines. I also went to Flight Radar 24. I went to a website that I could look at the Times Square. Oh, and actually, I looked at it was a webcam of downtown Tokyo that was not on YouTube, so I had that running for a while. And also, the way I did that is a lot of the actual browsing benchmarks, because you can't really manage it. You will fire up a browser tab. You go to a page, you scroll to the bottom, and then you go to a new page, you scroll to the bottom. And for my feelings, I want to make it actually realistic. So what I would do is I would start a tab, go to one page, leave that open, start another tab, go to the next page. So I'd have 6, 7, 8, 9 tabs open all at the same time. And of course, as you know it basically eats up memory, it eats up processing power. Google Chrome was not sent to Energy Saver. If you have 32 gigs of RAM in your laptop, it doesn't ask if you want to do that automatically because you have plenty of RAM to spare. So it doesn't try to push those tabs into the background and save power. So basically, I was doing all this browsing. I'd click on stories on both of those at the same time. I would drill down, I would read through them. And then I said, hey, you know what? Let's fire up Discord. So I installed Discord on both of those. It is not native to ARM, so that was emulated. I fired up Slack on both of those. I created a fake Slack accounts. I created an entire fake Slack channel. I had a third laptop where I could type notifications to it. So I had Discord. I had Slack running. It's like, hey, you know what? Fire up Word. I want to quit my job. I want to work on my resume. So I fired up Word on both of those. I used a Word template to edit a Word template. Then I did, okay, now I have to do some work. I fired up PowerPoint. It opened a very hefty 98-page PowerPoint presentation, scrolled through the whole thing, and then, hey, back to goofing off, browsing. And then I said, hey, I got to do some work. My boss wants me to convert that PowerPoint to PDF. So I opened up a second PowerPoint. It was actually smaller. It was about 15 pages. Graphically intensive, though. So I took that PowerPoint and I had it create using Acrobat, Adobe Acrobat. Again, I couldn't use the print driver, but if you're using PowerPoint with Acrobat installed, you can actually tell it to create an Acrobat file. So I created a PDF and I sent that, pretend like, okay, I have this. My boss doesn't like it, so I have to create it again. So I created that 4 different times. So, and then I went back and I went back to my 99-page PowerPoint. I was reading that, and then I created 2 PowerPoints out of that. So, this first run was fairly intensive because, after basically browsing for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, like, you know what, let's feed it something a little harder. So now I fired up Photoshop. So I started Photoshop in both of those. And by the way, like most people, I did not close out of PowerPoint. I did not close out of Chrome or Zoom or Discord. I just minimized it. And I know that drives people nuts, but that's what most people do. They just simply click the minimize because you're working on the document. You don't want to close it out and lose any of your changes. So a lot of people do that. So I opened up Photoshop. I edited a file. I replaced the sky, blah, blah, blah. Pretty light duty Photoshop work. And then I went ahead and fired up Lightroom Classic. And I took 772 raw files and I exported them to JPEG files. And then I fired up Excel and I did our, again, that Excel spreadsheet, the recalc. I know you think it's a benchmark, but it is, again, based on a real world test. And then after that, basically, driving it pretty hard for maybe an hour, driving it pretty hard with Photoshop and creating PDFs and all this other stuff, I went back to screwing around. So I'm like, okay, went back to the browser. I browsed the local website. And then let's do some goof off time. I just simply walked away from the laptops and just let it sit there for 10 minutes. And then I went back to, the laptops, just browsing and then browsing and browsing. And I waited for them to basically die. And I think it's a pretty real world test. Again, not the lightest thing in the world. So it's a good mix of, real world browsing with some real world, creations of PDFs, JPEG files, and some light duty Photoshop work. And then I basically let the laptop finish out watching YouTube full screen because, you know what, I'm done with work. I'm just going to screw around and watch YouTube at the end of the day. So how long did it last? So here's the result for real world test 1. And again, this is not easy to do because you cannot reproduce it, which is one of the weaknesses of doing this organically. But it's about as real world as you can get of that mix of workloads, which you just heard about. So what were the results of, running that workload on both of these laptops using the exact same inputs with the exact same mouse and keyboard with the same brightness in both these laptops? Here's result 1. As you can see, the Snapdragon X Elite, yes, it does have a 54 watt-hour battery versus the 75 watt-hour battery. But I was able to flatten that battery in basically, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4 hours. 4 hours, 252 minutes, and the Surface Laptop 7 basically tapped out, running out of power. I got a little bit more, all the way up to just over 5 hours with the ZenBook 14 OLED. And again, yes, it does have a larger battery, so you do have to account for that. But again, I did the exact same thing on both these laptops at the exact same time. So basically, browsing, Photoshop, Lightroom Classic, Zoom, Discord, Slack, PowerPoint, Acrobat, and Excel. Again, what it just kind of tells you is like, yes, I can guarantee you that if you are running, again, with Procyon, where you saw 10.5 to 12.5 hours out of these laptops, you can do that. But there's a lot of goof off time. This really didn't have as much goof off time. Yeah, sure, I had a 10-minute goof off time. But it's one of those things where I feel like if you basically walk away from your laptop for huge swaths of time and don't use it and let it go to sleep, yeah, you can get a lot of battery life out of these things. But frankly, if you're going to sit here and really, really drive the browser, and you're going to really use these things doing Photoshop and Lightroom Classic and Excel and all these kind of things out, get very power intensive. You saw how much power they use on the battery. You saw how much power they used on the wall. It's not free. And, these laptops all have fixed battery capacities and 54 watt hours, 4 hours of battery life. Driving a laptop this hard, I'm not too unhappy with. And same thing with that ZenBook 14 OLED. I think it's pretty realistic. So that was run 1. So let's do this. Let's look at the run 2. So what was the difference? So for run 2, I said, okay, again, this literally takes hours. So like if this took 5 hours to run, I had to sit there for 5 hours and drive this damn thing. For run 2, it's like, you know what? Okay, maybe I thought I had this crazy thing. Maybe it's because Discord is a problem and that is running the emulation layer. Because even though I had it minimized in the background, I wasn't really doing too much. I browsed a little bit on the Discord server for the fuller Discord server. But for the most part, it wasn't doing a lot. But maybe just simply having that run in the background in emulation is enough to hurt that Snapdragon X. So for run 2, I basically decided, you know what? We are not going to use Slack. We are not going to use Discord. So I kicked it off by firing up the Chrome browser, and I started to watch Gamers Nexus video on Noctua fans. Great video. Go watch that. And so I watched that full screen, which I think is very realistic. And I started at about 1:10 p.m. And for about 50 minutes, I basically watched that videos, Gamers Nexus videos for 50 minutes because you know what, 5-0, because that's very realistic. You watch it full screen. Again, I'm using earbuds to sort of minimize the audio subsystem. And then about 2 o'clock, I switched over to watching the full podcast in the background. And rather than actually having a foreground, I basically listen to it like a lot of people will do this. A lot of kids will do this and listen to music in the background, and they will have that tab going in the browser, but they're listening to it with the speakers or using earbuds, and that's what I did here. And I did make sure that both the streams were running the same. For the Gamers Nexus video and for the Full Nerd podcast, they were both encoded using VP9, and I was making sure they were both being served up the same resolution files. For some reason, it wanted to serve up 1440p. So basically, both of them were serving up the same resolution files. I thought, well, okay, it could get weird. Maybe you're getting AV1 on one. Maybe you're getting VP9, but no, I made sure that they were working the same. So at basically 2 o'clock, while listening to the Full Nerd podcast in the background, I basically browsed Amazon, SFGate, browsing. Then I went back to watching Full Nerd. After about 30 minutes of browsing, I went back to, okay, let's watch. That's interesting. Talking about something interesting on Full Nerd. I'll watch that for 30 minutes. And then after that, I went back to browsing news sites, ABC News, CNN, BBC, all these kind of like news sites, because I like news sites because they are jam-packed with ads, and they serve up ads, and they are messy. They are very, very messy. And I will say that is one of the problems that I had, because I had to decide, like, do I want to use ads? Do I want to use an ad blocker? Sure, plenty of people use ad blockers. And if you don't know, the problem with ad blocker or with running ads is you can go to the exact same page at the exact same time. Again, using the same device to click on a link on a story, you go to that page, or you launch that web page, you land there at the exact same time, milliseconds apart. The ad loads will be completely different. Some will be smaller, some will be larger. And of course, that means more data. Maybe one's using a different routine. Some could use a little more power. Should I use an ad blocker to eliminate that? But I felt like it was unfair, because the real world, you get ads. The real world, it gets messy. And I decided to keep it messy, and I kept those ads. So I kept those ads in there. But then it's like, okay, so real world, I read a story in ABC News. Oh, very interesting. I'm actually going to research Saipan Islands. So I went to Google Maps. I pulled up Google Maps. I scrolled around Google Maps to look at Saipan. I looked at the topo map. I looked at the satellite images, etc., etc. Then I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to CIA World Factbook to read about Saipan Island, because I knew nothing about Saipan Islands. So I'm reading about that for, another 15, 20 minutes. And like, hey, you know what? For some reason, I wanted to research Virginia-class submarines. I must have seen an ad or something. So I started reading about Virginia-class submarines. And I went to, Wikipedia. I compared to let's do image comparisons. I want to see is a Virginia-class sub larger than a Seawolf sub? How does it compare to Los Angeles? How does it compare to a Trafalgar? Just kind of like your typical screw around, go down the rabbit hole of the internet, where you're just simply browsing all kinds of different things to look at. So I'm just browse. And then I went to, Paul Thurrott's page, Thurrott.com. I love his stuff. Went there, read that for a while, screwing around, reading that. It's like, hey, we're back into tech now. So I went back to the Full Nerd stream, started listening to that. We looked at some tech pages. And then for some reason, hey, you know what? I'm still more interested in these submarines. Let's actually now pause the Full Nerd stream and listen to the Hunt for Red October theme in the background while I continue to read about Virginia-class submarines. So again, you're looking at a solid several hours of just simply browsing. And then hey, let's get into the Reddit for submarines. So I'm now reading the subreddit for submarines. Read there. And again, I started at about 110, about 357. I said, you know what? Oh, I'm going to work on my resume, because maybe I want to join the Navy. I don't know. So I fired up Word again, worked on my resume for a little bit. My attention span's not great. So then I fired up Full Nerd in the background to listen to that in the background while I worked on my resume, blah, blah, blah. Worked on the resume for about 10 minutes. And you know what? Let's go to Photoshop. So I fired up Photoshop now. I'm editing photos I've taken an air show of an F-22, various jets and planes, edit those things, clip and paste them into one image, change the background image. Okay. Do that for about 15 minutes. Then I fired up Lightroom Classic. I exported 100 JPEGs, so not the several thousand RAW files, but I exported 100 JPEGs, 90% setting, copyright, and then I exported 50 raw files. Okay, so not as heavy duty as before, where it was like 1,000 raw files. And then now let's do a PowerPoint again, because my boss wants me to do the PowerPoint. So again, I take that PowerPoint of like, it was like a 85-page PowerPoint, and I create a PDF. I don't like the way the PDF, it came out mangled. I don't like it. Create it again. Created it a third time. So I do that 3 times. And then I did a recalculation on the spreadsheet. That took about 10 to 12 minutes. Both of these are very heavy duty tasks. They are going to drain the battery. They're going to drive all of the cores very hard. And then, you know what? That's enough work for me, boss. I go back to browsing at about 5:17. So just browse. Let's go back to Reddit. Let's continue just scroll through Reddit and read popular. So let's go through and just look at videos on Reddit, scroll around. And then after about 20, 25, 30 minutes of that, I'll go back to watching the Full Nerd podcast full screen on these laptops, and then decide to let them go down till they die. So that's what I did for run 2. And again, previously you saw I flattened the Surface Laptop 7 in about 4 hours. And I flattened the ZenBook 14 in about 5 hours. For battery life run 2, I backed off on this being as hard, and I also threw out the running the Zoom call. I also threw out running Discord and Slack. But, again, I did have a couple things. I did have that recalc. I did have the PDF creations, but definitely not as hard as the first run. So what do we get run 2? Again, battery was 100% on both of these, 200 nits. So run 2, okay, a little bit better, but not still fantastic. We're basically looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. So we get about an extra hour out of the Snapdragon X Elite Surface Laptop 7, 306 minutes. It closes up the gap a little bit with that Core Ultra 7 and the ZenBook 14, basically 5.5 hours at 338 minutes. But again, I'm driving both of these laptops, decently hard, but not as hard as you think you would. But it's about as messy and real world as you can, using Chrome and both of those, multiple browsers, multiple pages, drilling down, reading actually the way a real person would read. Again, a lot of the browser benchmarks are pretty robotic. They go to a page, they scroll all the way down the bottom, they go to a new page, they scroll all the way down. I'm basically going halfway down the page. I use the mouse scroll wheel. I click on a story, drill down, go down that rabbit hole, then I click from there to the new story, go to another tab, do the same thing, and it's very real world. All of these things running in the background in a very, really messy world. And, 5 hours of battery life from 4 hours is, again, that's going to be the thing. Like, people go like, wow, that's not fantastic. But again, that's pretty realistic. I didn't do a lot of goof offing, like walking away, but still, so I was like, okay, well, run 2, interesting. You were like, well, is it possible it's something else? Is it possible I've eliminated the, I eliminated Discord emulation layer. I don't think it's an emulation part that possibly is like dragging down that Snapdragon X Elite. So let's do the third run. And is it possible even though they are matching USB gigabit Ethernet adapters plugged into USB-A, maybe that's using more power than Wi-Fi would on both these laptops. So I basically said, let's go to Wi-Fi, but I wanted to isolate them. So I basically set up a router between both those laptops. So very, very close to them. It was also isolated. They were the only two devices on the router. So no other devices. Yes, there are other Wi-Fi devices, but the router was sitting basically between the laptops to try to minimize the radio strength issues that you would get if you were trying to go around a wall to a router, 15 or 20 feet away. And I also did, for this one, set the Surface Laptop 7 to dark mode. It really shouldn't matter that much with an IPS panel over an OLED panel, but the ZenBook defaults to dark mode. You don't always get dark mode across all things, like the browser does not default to the dark mode, but I set both laptops to dark mode. I also went to Wi-Fi and both of those, Wi-Fi 6 for both of these. I did not have access to a Wi-Fi 7 router, so basically I was rolling Wi-Fi 6 on a small portable router, but very, very close. And for run 3, I said, well, let's change it up again. So 11 o'clock in the morning the next day, both laptops were off. They were, well cooled. Both of them, again, set to balanced. or balanced for the ZenBook and set to recommended for the Surface laptop. So 11 o'clock, I started to browse. So basically, this time though, since I realized that I don't think Discord was the issue, I actually started up Slack. I started up Discord. I minimized both of those after browsing for about 25 minutes. And I do want to point out, and this is something that I haven't said, but should be said. And again, I saw this with the results from the Office Procyon test. Things would noticeably launch slower on the Meteor Lake laptop. It just simply does not feel as snappy. Again, using the same mouse to launch the applications on both of them, the Snapdragon X was simply crisper. Things would launch faster. It would often take a second to a second and a half longer for the Core Ultra 7, the Meteor Lake laptop, to launch the same application or to sometimes go to a page. It was just a bit slower, and that actually is really there. The Snapdragon X Elite is just simply snappier than the Core Ultra 7 when both are set to basically their default recommended and balanced power and running on battery. I didn't really feel quite the same way when they were running on plugged into the wall. But when they were unplugged, the Meteor Lake laptop just simply felt a little bit slower. Not enough to be a game-changing. I'm not going to buy it because of that, but noticeably, again, you can only see this if you're launching them both at the same time using the same mouse. But it definitely was slower, and I could feel that. And I want to point that out because it's actually in my notes. I noted that again, just to point it out, like, hey, yeah, it definitely is slower. And again, so, after about 30 minutes of browsing, I continued to browse, reading again, I tried to okay, I'm not going to just concentrate on tech websites. I'm going to go to a lot of news websites again. On my third laptop, I created a bunch of fake Slack messages, sending myself Slack messages from the third laptop that would then simultaneously pop up on both laptops at the same time because Slack was minimized in the background. Again, that is a real world experience. You don't close out of Slack. You leave it open like everybody does. Otherwise, your boss knows you're not even working. So you leave Slack running. So I would send myself fake messages in Slack. At about 11:50, I got up and went and made some tea. I walked away for 10 minutes, leaving the browser open. And then I came back and I continued to browse. I was just browsing, hey, let's read some politics websites. So I went to Politico, The Hill, ABC News, NBC News, SF Gate. And then I slacked off for 15 minutes. I basically walked away for 15 minutes and did nothing because I was like, let's add a slack off minute because hey, let's just slack off and do nothing here. And then, I came back and I continued to browse. So now we're browsing local news sites, KTVU, KGO, all my local news sites. Again, opening new tabs, going into those websites occasionally. Some I would override. I would go into an existing tab, as we all do, and I would go to a new website there. Sometimes I would launch a new tab and then go to a new tab and then go to a new website. But on those sites, I would click on the website. I would scroll down, read the story, scroll down, read a story. Oh, this is interesting. Click on the story. Click on the story here. Read something, scroll, read, slow. So again, it is about as real world as you can get because I literally forced myself to read all these stories. So I would research things like, hey, let's read. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I got to about 128. My butt is hurting now because I've been browsing for several hours now. I basically fired up the Full Nerd podcast and I ran it full screen. And then I went to run it in the background. Okay, actually, I'm looking at my notes here. So I'm running it. I'm running it full screen. And then about 30 minutes after that, I said, okay, 1:55 p.m. I don't want to watch it full screen because I want to walk away. I actually set it up to browse in the background. So again, I continued to run the Full Nerd podcast in the background, listening to it. And again, VP9 1440p is what I was served up on Chrome by both of those on the same laptop. So I then put that in the background, continued to listen to it. Now, because I'm listening to a tech website, and I'm going to browse tech websites. So I didn't only want to hit our websites. I hit Tom's Hardware. I hit Video Cards, WCCF Tech, AnonTech, so on, so on. Just reading stories, clicking and reading interesting things. And again, very realistic. You know, I would read the story, scroll down, read the story, scroll down, read the story, trying to make it as real as possible. So now I'm like, okay, I'm finished reading. Now I'm going to fire up Word. We crank up Word, work on my resume a little bit more. And you know what? I'm out of ideas for my resume. I actually closed Word out because I was frustrated. Went back to watching The Full Nerd at about 2:58. So that's about another hour of browsing. And then, another 15 minutes of that. And it's like, you know what? I'm going to organize some photos. So I actually went to the laptops. I had all these loose JPEGs and RAW files on them. I basically copied them to new folders, copy, paste them again using the same mouse movements on both of those. So then I copied them to new folders because I wanted to organize them on those laptops. And then, you know what? Now we're going to do some browsing. Back to browsing. So I go back to the browser and I go to Reddit. I go to Reddit, popular, and basically it's where you get your never-ending ridiculous videos. So I basically would scroll down the page, look at the video, watch the silly video like you would in reality, and then I would go to the next video, watch that next video, next video, next video, just continuing on for an hour and 15 minutes of watching, reading Reddit, going back to browsing. And as you can tell, for basically this last run, the hardest thing I did was organizing those photos, right? I did not do raw file exports. I did not do PowerPoint. I did not do PowerPoint exports to PDF. I did a little bit of Word. This one was fairly lightweight, but again, this is very real world where I was browsing on all of these. But, my notes show I did not actually do, I did not do the Excel recalc, did I? Let's make sure. Yeah, definitely did not do the Excel recalc. So, yeah. Nope, not at all. Browsing, Word, organizing photos, copy and paste, browsing. So, definitely a lot of full screen video watching on Wi-Fi. And I tried that. So what's the result of Real World Run 3? This is it. So now we are actually, the Snapdragon X actually does outperform the ZenBook 14. Again, this is when you consider that it has a smaller battery, 54 watt hours versus 75 watt hours. That's a solid win. But again, yes, of course, there's OLED and all that caveat. But look, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 6.5 hours. That is probably, 85% browsing at this point. Some of that browsing is full screen video watching on YouTube. But I would count that as browsing rather than actually watching video, because to me, watching Netflix video would be a classic watching that. But, it does now actually outperform the Meteor Lake laptop, 385 minutes versus 370. But, frankly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of runtime for both of these for what is essentially a very heavy duty real world browsing is, not going to blow me away. And again, you've seen I've done 3 different real world tests now. First one was fairly heavy duty with some all-core loads. Second one was fairly heavy duty with some all-core loads as well, but not a majority of it. All of these at 200 nits, a very reasonable brightness. Again, first 2 were on gigabit Ethernet. The last one's on Wi-Fi in dark mode. About 6.5 hours continuously browsing or watching videos is not bad. That's for the most part, for most people, that's a full day of use. But not not this magical people saying like, I get 10 hours, I get 12 hours, I get 13 hours of browsing. And, and it makes you wonder, because remember, I'm doing this on both laptops at the same time. The mouse and keyboard inputs to both of them are exactly at the same time. I click on a story on SFGate on this laptop. it clicks on it on this laptop at the same time. It loads the page on both of them at the same time. So how do I square this? Because this is 3 world tests that has taken me in excess of 15 to 16, 17 hours to set up and run. And it makes you wonder, like, what is the reality? What is the actual truth here? Because, again, I ran UL Procyon Office multiple times, and I can solidly get 10.5 to 12.5 hours of battery life out of both of these laptops. But what I will tell you is both those laptops, even though there was a decent load on the CPU, occasionally very spiky, there was also a ton of downtime. There was just simply a ton of simulated downtime. And I do wonder if that's what is stretching out the battery life in all these. Because for the most part, I'm not just simply sitting here and letting the laptop sit here for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 25 minutes at a time. I'm browsing, I'm reading, I'm scrolling, I'm clicking in every single one of these in multiple tabs. I have things running in the background. And it just tells me that I think you can't rely on what some random person is telling you they're getting out of their laptop, because they have not sat down with identical laptops at the same settings, at the same brightness settings, and actually run them both exactly the same. Because again, these are 2 very different laptops with 2 very different screens with 2 different battery sizes. And for the most part, if you're going to work them pretty hard, the gas goes out of that gas tank pretty hard. You get great battery life, great gas, you get great mileage out of your car. Yeah, that's great until you're driving uphill with a gas pedal floored, with 5 people in the car, and it loaded up to the gill with luggage. You're just going to simply get lousy gas life, I think. And that's probably what we're seeing feeding into the first 2 runs. The third run is just simply browsing, and yeah, Snapdragon X is doing better, a little bit better. And considering that has a smaller battery life, that's a plus. I think it's a decent win, but there really is no magic bullet here. And I think that whenever you see people say they claim to get 15 hours or 16 hours of real world use, I would want to see them actually sit down and do exactly the same thing in a real messy way that they do on both those laptops, because it's entirely possible you shouldn't really expect more than 6 to 8 hours of battery life out of your laptop, which is still an entire day's of work for most people. And that's probably what you should realistically expect if you're actually doing work. Now, if you're going into Google Docs and you're editing a document and you're sitting there and you're thinking for 10, 12, 13 minutes, you type one sentence and you think for another 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 minutes, maybe the screen even goes to sleep. Yeah, you're probably going to get plenty of battery life out of it. But I think what we are seeing, the reality is there's just an awful lot of goof off time, nothing going on time that gets compressed in there that people simply are not counting in there. And that's how you're getting to these inflated claims of 12 hours of use. I can get 12 hours out of my laptop using it hard. No way. Because I can tell you, I've done this actual test with previous versions of the MacBook versus a Razer Blade laptop. There was a Razer Blade 16 versus the MacBook Pro 16. Yeah, MacBook Pro 16 was very impressive with efficiency in general, but if you actually drove the graphics card, the GPU in it really hard in both the laptops, or you drove the CPUs very hard in both of those with, an 80 to 90 watt hour battery, it did not matter. They were both dead in about an hour and a half. So if you're driving it really hard, it doesn't matter. So I just think the reality is, yes, the benchmarks are useful. Yes, UL Procyon telling me you can get 12.5 hours out of the Snapdragon X Elite is super handy, because that is actually very realistic. Because if I go like, well, what can you get out of a UL Procyon run out of an OmniBook, an HP OmniBook, or an XPS 13, or a Lenovo ThinkPad with a Snapdragon X? Those are all comparable because you actually have the same SoC, you have different batteries, you do have different screens, but it is doing the exact same thing with the same sort of downtime on both of those. And that's also very comparable to a Core Ultra 7 in a different laptop as well. So that benchmark is very realistic. And if I take those same laptops and I'm doing a video rundown test, that's realistic as well, because if I'm getting 25 hours out of brand A and I'm getting 20 hours out of brand B and I'm getting 22 hours out of brand C, that's entirely completely realistic. However, if you're not simply going to sit there and watch a local video for 25 hours, that doesn't apply to you. If you're not going to sit down and basically screw around all day by looking at your screen doing nothing for hours and hours at a time, then maybe those benchmarks don't apply to you either. So you just have to set your reality based on how you actually use it. And there is no easy answer to this. But what I can tell you from doing this test after 3 days of it, that battery life is pretty good. Snapdragon X, not bad at all. Frankly, a little bit better than the ZenBook 14 with the bigger battery. I factored that in. Yes, OLED, et cetera. But overall, pretty good. Still no magic bullet. But I'm not so sure the magic bullet exists anywhere out there. And I think a lot of it's just simply fish stories, because if I took two other brands of laptops and it did the exact same thing, I bet we'd get a lot closer to that 6 to 5 hours of battery life out of those as well. So we'll have to see as we get there. Overall, though, great battery performance out of Snapdragon X, decent battery performance, great performance when plugged into the wall. Overall, better battery efficiency out of Snapdragon X. The big caveat is there's going to be a lot of stuff that doesn't work, and maybe you would just simply rather have it all work with your Intel and AMD laptop, something you need to consider. But again, this is not the last word on Snapdragon X or Windows on ARM. There's just so much more to unpack. There's gaming, there's graphics performance, there's other brands of laptops, more to come. But if you want to see it, go to PCWorld.com to read about it. And of course, come back to PC World's YouTube channel to see more in-depth testing, because this ain't over yet, folks. So keep coming back here and click that like and subscribe button.